Some of you may have heard that Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real-life ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in the Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start as a ghost town. Disney's cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is a fact. Look it up. Disney blew 30 million dollars on the place. Yes, $30 million. Then they abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters too shallow for their ships to safely operate, and there was even blame cast on the workers, saying that they were they were from the Bahamas. They were too lazy to work a regular schedule. That's where the factual nature of the story ends. It wasn't because of sand. It obviously wasn't because foreigners were lazy. Both are convenient excuses. No, I sincerely doubt those reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy the official story? Because of Mowgli's Palace. Near the beach side of Admiral Isle in North California, Disney began construction of Mowgli's Palace. In the late 1990s, the concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. If you're unfamiliar with the character Mowgli, then you might better remember the story Jungle Book. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you might know it as a Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened and pursued by other animals. Mowgli's palace was controversial undertaking from the start. Disney brought up a ton of high-priced land for the project. There was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, which turned around and sold properties to Disney. To one point, a home that had just been constructed was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly for a fictional highway project. Knowing full well that what was going on, people started calling it the Mickey Mouse Highway. Then there was the concept art. A group of staff search from Disney Co. actually held a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. When they sold the concept art, this gigantic Indian parent surrounded by jungles stuffed with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear. Wow, suffice to say, everyone flipped their shit. We're talking about a large Indian place, jungle and loincloths, not only in the center of relatively wealth area, but also a somewhat xenophobic area of southern USA. It was a questionable mix at that point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. Disney took that company and essentially broke it after over its knee as well. The houses were raised, the land was cleared, and there was a damn thing anyone could do or say about it. The local TV newspapers were against the resort at the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media holdings and local venues came into play, and their opinion turned on in time. So anyway, Treasure Island and Bahamas, Disney sunk those millions in and then split. The same thing happened with Mowgli's Palace. Construction was complete. Visitors were actually stayed at the resort. The surrounding communities were flooded with traffic and the usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irate tourists. Then it all stopped. Disney shut it down and nobody knew what the hell to think. They were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this in the first place. I honestly didn't give the place another thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I believe maybe 4 hours from Emerald Isle. So really, I only hear the rumblings and didn't experience any of its firsthand. Then I read this article from someone who had explored the Treasure Island resort and posted a whole blog about all the crazy shit he found there. Stuff just left behind, things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by the disgruntled former employees who had lost their jobs. Hell, the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking that place. People there felt as angry about Treasure Island as folks here did about Mowgli's parents. Plus, there's rumors that Disney had released their aquarium stock into the local waters when they closed, including sharks. Who wouldn't want a few swings at some merchandise after that? Well, what I'm getting at is that this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though many years has passed since its closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration at Mowgli's Palace. Take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there was anything I could take home as a memento. I'm not going to say I wasted no time getting there, but honestly, it took me another year after I first found the Treasure Island article to get around to going up to Admiral Isle. Of over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the palace resort, or rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of the place that had been scrubbed clean. Even odder, however, was that nobody before myself had apparently thought to blog about the place or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though that has to be expected since they all swung Disney's way. They wouldn't be out there lowering in your embarrassment, you know. Recently, I learned that corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from search results. Basically, for no good reason. Looking back, it's probably that nobody spoke of the resort, but rather their words were made inaccessible. So in the end, I could barely find the place, or I had to go on as how map I received in the mail back in the 90s. It was a promotional item sent out to people who recently been to Disney World. And I guess since I had been in the late 80s, that was recent. I didn't really intend to hang on to it. It just got shoved into my books and comics from my childhood. I only remembered it months into my research. And even then, it took me another few weeks to locate the story spin my parents had stuffed it all into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most were transplants who had moved to the beach in recent years. All old residents were just sneered at me and made rude gestures the second I managed to say, "Where could I find Mowgli's?" Drive took me through an inordinately long corridor by overgrown tropical plants that had run rampant and overpopulated the area, mixed with the native species of flora that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort, tremendous monolithic wooden gates whose support to the other side looked like they've been cut from giant Syconias. The gate itself had been ground in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging at the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap with hand-painted letters scrawled in black, abandoned by Disney. Clearly the handiwork of some past local or an employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open enough to walk through but not drive. So grabbing my digital camera and the map, whose flip side showed a layout of the resort, I set off on foot. The inner grounds of the place were just overgrowth as the entryway. Palm trees stood untended and wagged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants similarly stood in their own sinking bug-riddled refuse. There was this sort of clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxious tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. All that remained of the outdoor structures were broken walking wood and various charred bits of unidentifiable material that was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar was now simply a pile of assorted trash chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing on the grounds was a statue of Baloo, the friendly bear of the jungle, which stood in a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial wave toward no one, staring into empty space with a silly, toothy grin as bird-shit covered the whole swatch of his fur and vines and shot his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only the only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti, where the original paint had been peeled and chipped away. Front doors weren't just open, they had been taken off the hinges and were stolen. Above the front doors of the gaping mall, where they had been, someone had once again painted "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you about all the awesome stuff I saw in the palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cast, registers a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums, but no. Inside the building was so stark, not so bare, that I actually think people had stolen the molding of the wall. Actually, that was too big to steal. Counters, desks, and Countless deaths, giant fig trees, they were all resting amid to this empty echo chamber that amplified my every step like a slow wet attack of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan, hit it to all locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen was as you imagine it, the industrial food prep area with all the appliances and space no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. The huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had row upon row of empty shelf space. Hooks hung from the ceiling, hopefully, probably, probably for hanging cuts of meat. As I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging, each hook in a random direction, but their movement was so slow and small that it was almost impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by footsteps. I stopped one by clutching it in my fist, then carefully letting it go, but within a few seconds it started to swing once more. The bathroom were in the same state as the rest of the place. Just like the Treasure Island Resort, someone had methodically smashed each porcelain common with coconuts and other implements. There were about a half-inch rancid, stinking, stagnant water on the floor, and I didn't stay there very long. What's odd in that is that the toilet and the sinks and beatings in the living room. Yes, I went there, all dripped and leaked, just ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have sucked the water off long, long ago. There were plenty of rooms in the resort, but naturally I didn't have the time to look through all of them. The few I did to peer were in similarly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find anything there. I thought there was actually a television or radio in one room. As I really think I heard a quiet conversation coming out, though it was like a whisper, probably my own breathing echoing in the silence, or another case of sound of, of flowing water playing tricks on the mind. This is what it sounded like. I didn't believe it. Short, unknown reply. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Your father told you. Unknown reply, apostly just weeping. I know, that sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced. Why I thought might have been something running in that room, or worse, some vagrants who had holed me up there and probably got knives and probably would have knifed me. The front doors of the palace again. I figured I hadn't found anything of note and wasted the trip up. As I looked out the door, I noticed something interesting about the courtyard I apparently missed. Something that would have at least one thing to show for all my trouble, even if it was just a photograph. There was a lifelike statue of a python, maybe, maybe 80 feet long, coiled up and sunning itself on a pedestal right at the center of the area. It was almost where the sun started setting, so the light fell onto the object. Perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved closer again to get the detail on his face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head and looked directly into my eyes, turned and slid off the pasture, past the grass, and into the trees. Its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail left the sunning spot. Its knee had released all their exotic animals onto the ground. Right there on my foot plan mat was the reptile house. I should have known. I read about the sharks at the treasure isle. I would have known they had done this. I was dumbfounded. I was utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back to the earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, towards the palace. Even though it was totally gone, I was still taking any chances and backed my way into the building. It took a few deep breaths and slaps at my own face to get myself right in the head after that. I looked for a place to sit down as my legs were feeling a bit jelly at this point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in the broken glass and dead leaf carpet or haul myself onto a desk testimony unreliability. I seen some of the stairs near the Disney lobbies and decided to have a seat there and felt better. The staircase was far enough from the front of the building to be relatively clean, save for startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall, once again painted with the abandoned by Disney motto I become accustomed to. I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat on it to keep it at least somewhat clean. I at the stairway led downward, below ground level. Using my camera flash as a sort of improvised flashlight, I could see that the staircase ended up in metal mesh door with a padlock, with a sign, a real sign. Read, mascots only, thank you. This perked up my spirits a little bit for two reasons. One, a mascots only area would have definitely had some interesting stuff back in the day. Two, the padlock was in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the one place I had to explore and perhaps find something interesting to photograph or wantonly steal. I had come to the palace. Essentially agreeing with myself that it was okay to take anything I wanted. Because hey, abandoned. It didn't take much to bust the lock. Or actually that's wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was hooked to. Time and decay had done most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws off the wall. Nobody else had apparently hadn't been able to do at the time. Mascot's only area and very well was startling and very welcome stage. And the rest of the building I've seen for one. Every second altered fluorescent light overhead illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken, even if aids and exposure were definitely taking their toll. Tables had notepads and pens. There were clocks, even a punch-in clock from the wall, complete of filled-out cards. Chairs were scattered around, and was a small break room with an old static filled television and long watered out food, drink, and on the counters. It was like those post-apocalypse movies, where everything is left in a state of evacuation. I walked the maze-like sub-basement hallways of the mascot's only area. The sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over. Papers were scattered and almost mangled, with the damp floor and large carpet of mold and was slowly overtaking the real wafting crimson floor of covering. Everything was sort of squishy. Everything would disintegrated into mass when I applied even the least amount of force, and floating items hanging on tools on hooks in one of the rooms simply fell in moist shreds if I had to unhook them. One thing that annoyed me was the light was becoming more sparse and reliable as I went further to the dark, suffocating depths of the place. Eventually, I reached the black and yellow striped door with the words Character Prep 1 Instance Skies on it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured this was probably the costumes were kept, and definitely wanted a photograph of that twittered stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick that I tried on the door wouldn't budge. That is, until I gave up and started to walk away. There was one slight popping sound of the door and creaked open slowly. Inside the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used the camera flash for a light switch on the wall, but but there was nothing. By the door, wow, nice spelling there. There was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred by oh, As I made my search, I jogged out a sense of excitement by a bounce of electrical buzz, zzz, row of lights overhead suddenly flashed to life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest I passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust. It seemed like the light was going to just getting brighter until all the bulbs exploded. But just when I thought it would reach the critical stage, the light dimmed a bit and steadied. The room was exactly as I pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together like strange cartoon Ken Davis from Invisible Nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and native clothes on hangers toward the back. What I found odd and what I wanted to photograph right away was a Mickey Mouse costume at the center of the room. Unlike other costumes, it was laying on its back in the center of the floor like a murder victim. The fur of the costume was rotten and shedding, creating bare patches. And even odder, however, the coloring of the costume, it was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey Mouse. Black where the and white where it should be. If he would be black, his normally red overalls were light blue. The sight was off-putting and enough that I actually put off photographing the thing until last. I took a picture of the costumes hanging on the wall, upward angles, downward angles, side shots, to show an entire row of frozen putrid cartoon faces with some plastic eyes missing. Then I decided to stage a shot. Just one of the bedraggled character heads on a slick, grimy floor. I reached for the headpiece of a Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked into the face of the wide-eyed, mouldering head, a loud clattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and there between my shoes was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and the lower jaw remained staring up at me. I dropped the duck head immediately, as you expect, and moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, looked back to the scar on the floor. I had to take a picture of it. I had to, for many numbers of reasons that may seem silly. But only if you don't think it through. Need proof of what happened. Especially if Disney was going to somehow make this way go away. I had to no doubt in my mind right from the start that even it was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Disney, the photo negative opposite Mickey in the middle of the floor, started to get up. Started sitting up, then climbing to its feet. The Disney, the Mickey Mouse costume or whoever was inside it stood there at the center of the room, no fake face staring directly at me as I mumbled no over and over and over. No, 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 no! With shaking hands, violently thrusting hard and legs that once again turned to jelly, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature, now quietly sizing me up. The digital camera screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, mirroring up the screen wherever Mickey's outline moved to. When the camera died, went blank, and quiet and broken, I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. Hey, he said in a hushed, reverted, but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. Want to see my head come off? It started to pull off its own head, working its clumsy, glove-clad fingers around its neck with clawing, impatient movements, similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free of a predator's jaws. As it worked its digits to the neck, so much blood, so much thick, junky, yellow blood. It turned as I heard a snickering tearing of cloth and flesh, only cared about getting away above the doorway of this room. I saw the final message, clawed into the metal with bone of fingernails. Abandoned by God. I never got the pictures of the camera. I never wrote the blog entry about it. After that, I ran from the place, fled for my sanity, if not my very life. I knew why Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in. They didn't want anything like that getting out.